Man, I was just talking about the importance of a southern border in many of the, practical ways, but also philosophical ways, Michael. I mean, the practical effect is the crisis that we've seen across the nation. You saw some of it first in San Francisco, but all over the nation when it comes to fentanyl. But on a philosophical level as well, like what is the idea of a nation state? Does the United States have an identifiable and maintainable culture? But there's clearly a thought process out there, Michael, represented perhaps most notably now because of Davos with the World Economic Forum, that sees a more utopic vision for the world that seemingly, Michael, rejects the idea of the nation state.
Yeah. Hey, Will, it's good to be with you again. Yeah, I agree. Absolutely. I think there's basically two competing visions. I mean, one is of civilization as we've had it for, thousands of years, really, and the particular form of liberal democracy that we've pioneered in the United States. And it's not that complicated, really. I mean, you do have to have borders that function. You have to have law and order, meritocracy, cheap energy. And if you want it to be a democracy, you need free speech. You need to have elections. So in some ways, it's so simple. But yeah, I think there's been this challenging paradigm which says really no decisions are best made at the global level. It's best made at the United Nations or the World Economic Forum or the World Health Organization or UNESCO or you name it, many other global organizations. You see, what's interesting, and you notice this, it's really important to elites that they be able to move people around the world. This is extremely important to elites in Europe. It's important in the United States. They are very focused on censoring and spreading their own disinformation around this issue, suggesting that's not a problem. It's now gone to the point where obviously it is a huge problem, but demonizing anybody that raises concerns around the importation of large numbers of unskilled workers, which obviously dampens wages for working people, sort of dismissing all those concerns as racist. We were looking at how there's just a small number of messages that elites use to basically disparage and demonize their opponents. And they're very interesting. It's basically that they're racists, that they're fascists, that they're somehow connected to Russia. And you might think, well, those are, all things that they think are true. But it's notable that they also, they don't say things like, oh, it's economically inefficient. That was an argument that was used in Brexit briefly. But even in Brexit, the focus was on Russia. So you see there's a very intense focus to kind of frame populists, nationalists. Mostly that's people on the right, but it is not necessarily that. But what we've documented and where we've come to after a year of this now is really that what you're seeing is elites engaged in counter-populism, and they're using the same tactics and tools that they developed in the war on terrorism. And this is why it's been so confusing in terms of left and right, because we associate the war on terrorism, at least initially, with George W. Bush. Of course, it was heavily prosecuted by Obama. But you get to the end of the Obama administration, you get to Trump, Brexit in 2016 and Trump's election, and you see elites start to turn these counter-terrorist tools into counter-populist tools.
Mike, we throw that word around. I use the word a lot. You've used it numerous times in your answer to me just now. Elites. Who are the elites?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to make it, I'm not trying to be super fancy with it. I just mean, college-educated people that tend to work in journalism. That tend to be, we sometimes say professional managerial class. That's a concept that was developed by James Burnham to describe how, as capitalism becomes more complex, particularly after World War II, you have all these different agencies. I mean, there's so many government agencies that many people don't even know of or have even heard of. So you have this huge class of educated people that work in, NGOs and media, in journalism, in government, in corporations. The idea used to be that corporations were where the conservatives and Republicans were. We've seen even that's changed, right? Mm-hmm. Where the corporations are the one that are pushing a pretty radical trans agenda, pushing, a pretty radical climate agenda, Black Lives Matter. And really sort of moralizing a new morality, what you might call a new woke morality on the whole population. So that's who I mean by elites.
But what do you think, Mike, is the through line? There was a time when we would have used that term probably to stratify a country economically. So the elites you would be presumed to be the wealthier side of society, but I'm not sure wealth does the job of describing elites. Many people have written about this. Is it education level? Is it worldview? Is it a mindset? By the way, it's also sort of international. It's not defined by necessarily American colleges or American elites. There's a commonality. And I'm not rejecting the existence of elites, Mike. I'm definitely not. I believe as well with you that there is a small group of people defining what is acceptable, what's acceptable to see, what's acceptable to think, what's acceptable to read, even to some extent what's acceptable to eat. But I'm not sure what defines them. What's a through line of who makes up the elite?
Yeah, it's such a great question, Will. I think it's, really, if you go from World War II until, let's say, 2016, with this populist revolution, both political parties, left and right, but also you saw in Europe, had elites, and then, educated, affluent elites, and then working folks. What really happens after 2016 is that it starts to split by party. So you start to see, the elites really kind of moving more to the left. So you see the Never Trump Republicans, who I would say are more professional managerial class elites, becoming more Democrat. Many of the folks that had been Democrats that were more working class, and even some that are sort of anti-interventionist, anti-imperialist left-wing people like Matt Taibbi, like Glenn Greenwald, like my colleagues at Public, and to some extent myself, because that was my history as well. You start to sort of see, we start to sympathize more with the anti-interventionism of nationalism and populism. So you start to see that. Now, I guess, to some extent, you're always going to have leaders and you're always going to have folks that are educated and providing some of that leadership. But I think maybe the better way to think of it is that really the professional managerial class ends up on the left much more strongly than I think it did before 2016.
Mike, I am fascinated by guys like Glenn Greenwald and Matt Taibbi and yourself, who were, I can't speak to you, and Matt and I have had our own conversations, and I've talked to Glenn as well, who weren't just men of the left, but were reliable, celebrated. I do not think they would have even been self-described as centrist left prior to the last 5 some odd years. And again, I'm not as familiar with your entire resume, Mike, in terms of where your ideological bent has been throughout your career. But I do think it's fair to say you were probably, and you just said to us, probably someone who would have been self-described on the left. What is it that's changed? Like for them, for you, why are you now seeing yourself distinct from whatever's happening to the left?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, I mean, all of us have slightly different trajectories. I think Glenn and Matt are probably a little bit more similar. I was already becoming more moderate around environmental issues because I supported things like fracking and nuclear power. On homelessness, I support mandating psychiatric care and rehab to people who break the law as an alternative to jail, as opposed to the much more libertarian, radical left policies of the West Coast, and that's what San Francisco's about. But I've always been very skeptical and critical of U.S. military interventions abroad. I was against the invasion of Iraq, against the long-term occupation of Afghanistan. Many of those other interventions I've been opposed to. Not always opposed, not knee-jerk, but certainly skeptical of those interventions. So I think all of those things participated in it. I think all of us, and this would go also, I think, for Elon Musk and many of the rest of us that are more Gen X left, was that really we do not like wokeism. We don't like the I just had a conversation about this. I think a lot of millennials don't know what it was like in the 80s and 90s. In the 80s and 90s, and I don't want to overly romanticize it, but I mean, there was more of a sense of which all that race stuff, the boomers dealt with that. Now you can date people from different colors and you go to different parties and you hang out, and it's kind of that the baggage, there's probably still baggage there, but it wasn't anywhere as intense as it was in the 60s. You get to like the 2000s and even before the rise of social media, but the rise of social media, you sort of see it all come back around race and sex, and you're like, really, are we really going to then go and we're going to go do this again? I mean, I thought we did that in the late 60s and it ended badly. So I think a bunch of us got turned off by that.
Yeah.
I genuinely think that is why Elon bought Twitter. It was, people will say it was restore Babylon B. I think it's kind of it's a useful metaphor. I think it was really like it's a toxic environment where somehow it was, bad to be white, bad to be heterosexual, bad to be American. It was a very just a very negative discourse. I think we all know what we're talking about. So I think a lot of us were turned off to that because it's not liberal. It's not actually what we meant by liberal anyway. I know that it's what people call liberal, but it's actually quite illiberal. And this idea of silencing people, there's something wrong with you psychologically if you want to make other people shut up. I mean, you can ignore people. So this desire to censor, to deplatform, to cancel, it comes from a bad place psychologically that I think that, earlier in the Gen X period, I think we had a more, properly liberal view, which was like, hey, that's your thing. I don't agree, but, let's just kind of be more chill about it.